Hey, I'm Gail Anderson, 33 years old, and I need to tell you about my wedding. The one where my mother handed me a box in front of 120 people, and there was nothing inside. She smiled the whole time. She'd choreographed the moment. But here's what nobody talks about. That empty box wasn't the worst thing she did that night. 20 minutes later, my grandmother pressed something into my hands, and that's what shattered my family. What my mother nearly did when I opened that second gift at the head table, I'll carry to my grave. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. We sit with the quiet fractures that remake a family, the ones at kitchen counters and reception halls, not courtrooms. If stories about quiet dignity and refusing to flinch speak to you, leave a comment and subscribe. Let me rewind because a box doesn't just arrive empty by mistake. I'm a paralegal in a small firm 2 streets from the courthouse. I read contracts for a living. I catch the missing word, the loophole, the silent omission. In my family, I was always the one who showed up. When Grandma needed a ride to her cardiology appointment, I drove. When someone needed to hold a hospital vigil overnight, that someone was me. When my sister Renee forgot our mother's birthday, I bought the present and signed for both of us. The single word my family ever used for me? Dependable. Not brilliant, not courageous, not pretty. Dependable, like a washing machine that runs on schedule. My mother, Carol, kept a running ledger in her head. Every gesture came with a price tag. You earned your chair at the table by being useful, and no one ever stamped the tab paid. I got very good at paying it. I brought pans of lasagna to funerals for people I'd only met once. I remembered every anniversary down to the hour. I picked up the phone at 2 a.m. without ever asking why it was always my number that rang. Somewhere along the way, I made a silent pledge to myself. The kind you don't speak out loud. I figured if I just did enough, did it perfectly, one day the tab would finally clear. I never let myself finish that sentence. Enough for what, exactly? I didn't want to know. Deep down, I suspected the prize at the bottom of the box was hollow. I just didn't imagine my mother would gift wrap that hollow and present it live in front of everyone. Then I met Danny Marsh, and for the first time, nobody toted up a bill. Danny is a lineman. He scales telephone poles in sleet and ice so the rest of us keep our lights humming. His hands could prove it, rough and scarred and warm. We met when a transformer blew on my street and half the block went dark for 2 days. He was the one still up at 11 p.m. when everyone else had gone home. I walked out with a coffee because the air was bitter, and he took it like I'd handed him something precious. We talked in the dark for an hour. He asked me things no one had asked me in years. Not about my job title, but about what I loved. Not about my tax bracket, but about what cracked me up. When I told him I was a paralegal, he didn't ask about the salary. He asked if I liked my coworkers. On our 3rd date, he fixed a neighbor's broken porch light and wouldn't take the 20 she tried to press on him. That's just Danny. He spots a broken thing and quietly makes it whole again. No invoice follows. The first time he really looked at me, I felt something I couldn't label. Then it clicked. He saw me as already enough. Not enough if, not enough when, just enough. I'd spent 31 years auditioning for my family, and this stranger in a hard hat had handed me the part on day 1. I loved him before I let myself say the word out loud. And I already dreaded the single moment I'd have to bring him home to meet my mother. The engagement dinner happened at a restaurant my mother picked specifically because the menu wasn't posted online. 14 of us around a long table. Carol had prepared a seating chart. That should have been my first warning. She put Danny at the far end, right beside a folding card table where Renee's daughter Sophie and 2 cousins were doodling on paper placemats. The kids' table. She did it with a smile, the way she does every cruel thing, so that if you objected, you became the one making a scene. Danny sat down without complaint and started teaching 9-year-old Sophie how to draw a house that wouldn't collapse. Halfway through the meal, my mother called across the table in a sweet voice, asking him to share what a man in his line of work brought home annually. She called his work squirrel-style pole climbing. My aunt laughed. Renee laughed half a beat later, the way she always echoes our mother, always trailing, always louder. Danny gave the number plainly, unashamed. My mother echoed it slowly so the whole table could absorb how modest she thought it was. I opened my mouth. Under the table, a hand found my knee and squeezed. Not Danny's. I glanced over. My 84-year-old grandmother Ruth was quietly folding her napkin and rising. She walked the entire length of the table past the empty chair beside my mother and sat down next to Danny at the kids' table. She asked about ice storms. She asked if he ever got scared way up there. The whole table went silent. That was my first glimpse of light in 33 years, and I didn't yet understand why my grandmother, of all people, had crossed the room to sit beside him. My mother has a habit that reveals everything about her. When she's angry, she opens the calculator app and starts thumbing numbers like she's tallying damages. She did it in the passenger seat after dinner. Thumb, thumb, thumb. Then she dropped the sentence I'd been dreading since childhood. She called my marriage a bad investment. She said it the way she'd say a stock had cratered. She reminded me our family had a name in town, a standing that mattered, and I was about to torch it for a pole climber. Then she looked at me sideways and said something I didn't fully decode yet. If I went through with it, I shouldn't expect anything to still be there for me. My part, she called it. Don't come asking about your part. I asked her what part. She just kept tapping the phone. I assumed she meant her approval, which I'd never truly had anyway. I assumed she meant an inheritance line, a figure I'd never seriously counted on. What I didn't know was that my part had a street address, a lake behind it, and a set of stairs my grandfather built plank by plank. I didn't know Carol had already decided to put it on the market and that she needed me broken and obedient before she could. I sat in the passenger seat watching my mother add me up and finding the sum short. And for one ugly second, some small inner child wondered if her arithmetic might be right. There's a house I have to describe. My grandfather, Walter, constructed it himself on a small lake 25 minutes outside town, board by board, across roughly a decade. I don't know how a working man found the hours. I only know every tender memory of my childhood lives inside those walls. Grandpa taught me to cast a line off the dock he built. He showed me how the staircase was fitted so the treads would never creak. And to this day, they don't. He passed 6 years ago when I was 27. I still catch myself reaching for the phone to tell him things. My grandmother Ruth lives there alone now, 25 minutes past the final traffic light. I drive out most weekends, because someone should and because I want to. 2 weeks before the wedding, I stopped by Carol's house to hand her some documents, and I caught her on the phone in the kitchen. She was using her business voice, the polished one. She was speaking with a realtor about the lake property. She said, clear it out. She said, outdated. She was selling my grandfather's house, the only place on earth that still carried his scent, like sawdust and lake water and morning coffee. I stood in the hallway with the papers in my fist and felt the floor tilt. Then I remembered one anchor and held it. The house wasn't hers. It was in my grandmother's name, always had been. Carol could want it sold until her face turned blue, but the signature line belonged to Ruth. I didn't yet grasp how violently my mother was already working to pry that pen loose. 3 days later, Carol made her next move, and she made it in writing. She blasted an email to the entire extended family, both sides, aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole clan. She announced she was rescinding her offer to help fund the wedding. She'd promised to cover the venue and the dinner months earlier in front of witnesses. Now she was publicly ripping that promise back. She wrote that she didn't invest in ventures with poor fundamentals. She actually typed that about her own daughter's marriage. She CC'd 30 people so they all understood it was a dare. Cancel the wedding, come crawling back, apologize for humiliating the family, and maybe the check reappears. That was the entire intent of doing it publicly. She wanted me to feel the walls narrowing. Danny read the email over my shoulder, set his jaw, and said a single sentence. We'll pay for it ourselves then. And so we did. We relocated to the fellowship hall of the little church on Route 9. We did the arithmetic at the kitchen table like two grown-ups. $14,000 from our own savings, most of it his. No chandelier, no plated dinner, folding tables, string lights, and a potluck of casseroles from people who genuinely loved us. I cried at that table, but not the way you'd anticipate, because for the first time, the wedding belonged to us. No one had purchased it, which meant no one could repossess it. Something in my chest loosened that had been clenched my whole life, though I didn't have the vocabulary yet. I'd learn the word soon enough, and I'd nearly bargain it away for the very prize Carol was dangling. A week before the wedding, Renee let something slip. We were finishing the place cards at my apartment, and my sister, who can't keep a secret to save her life, giggled and said Mom had prepared a special reception gift, something for the whole room to witness. She said it like it was a party trick. I asked what it was. She covered her mouth and said she'd sworn not to tell, which meant she was bursting to. All she'd add was that Carol wanted to make a point in front of everyone.
I got a chill in my gut. The same chill I get when a contract contains language that's too clean. That night my mother rang, ostensibly about parking arrangements at the church. Near the end, in that translucent voice she reserves for her sharpest instruments, she said, "Don't worry, dear. The reception gift will show everyone precisely what this marriage is worth." Then she said goodnight like she'd just complimented my hemline. I hung up, and I knew, the way you know weather's about to turn, that she'd built me a trap and wrapped it in ribbon. Here's the part people never understand about that kind of moment. I couldn't cancel. It was my wedding. You don't call off your own wedding because your mother has a surprise planned. You can't uninvite 100 people. You can't release the hall reservation. You can't decline a gift publicly without becoming the villain of your own biography. So I did the only thing available. I decided that whatever lurked inside that box, I would not give her the reaction she'd paid for. I had no clue that my grandmother had been quietly assembling a box of her own for 60 years. The morning of the wedding, the church hall on Route 9 smelled like coffee and lilies and fresh floor wax. Danny got there before the caterer, before the florist, before me. When I walked in, he was up a ladder in his undershirt, restringing the fairy lights himself because he didn't trust how the previous setup hung. Of course he was. The man mends things. He'd wired the whole hall so every bulb flipped on together, and when he hit the switch and the room flooded with warm little stars, Sophie clapped. She'd appointed herself my unofficial attendant for the day, trailing behind me and holding my veil off the dusty floor with enormous seriousness. She asked if it was true I was marrying a man who could repair anything. I told her it was. My phone buzzed while I was buttoning my dress in the Sunschool room. It was my grandmother. Her voice was low and even. The register she uses when something matters. She said she was coming, no matter what Carol had arranged about transportation, and she'd find her own way. Then she said something that stopped me mid-button tonight. When it happens, I want you to hold on to me. Whatever they do, you stay close to me and you wait. Can you do that for your old grandmother? I said yes without understanding what I was agreeing to. I asked her what was coming. She only said, "You'll see." Then she added, "Gail, don't open anything until I tell you to." She hung up, and I stood in a half-buttoned gown, heart hammering, because Ruth had never in her life sounded like a woman with a contingency plan. The ceremony was the best 20 minutes of my life, right up until I looked at my mother. We kept it modest. No soloist, just Danny and me and a pastor who'd known us both our whole lives. Danny wrote his own vows on a piece of paper so refolded it had gone soft. He didn't say anything about forever or fairy tale endings. He said he'd keep my lights on. He said when the whole world went dark and cold, I'd never have to wonder if he was still climbing toward me. His hands were shaking. Mine were too. Sophie held the veil. The little hall was packed with people who'd brought potato salad and folding chairs and their whole hearts. And in the front row sat my mother in a dress that cost more than our catering budget, hands folded in her lap, thumb moving. Even there, even then, even under the table, she was running her totals. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She calculated. Halfway through the vows, the double doors at the back of the hall burst open and someone wheeled my grandmother in. Carol had not arranged a ride for Ruth. Carol had specifically told the family that Grandma was too worn out to attend and shouldn't be troubled. Yet there she was, in her good blue dress, being pushed down the aisle by a neighbor she'd called herself. A small box sat in her lap, wrapped in craft paper and tied with twine. She held it with both hands like it was the only thing in the entire room that counted. Carol turned and spotted her mother. For half a heartbeat, something crossed her face that I couldn't decode. It looked, of all things, like fear. At the reception, you could feel the two circulating like oil and water refusing to blend. Danny's people were loud and easy, hugging strangers, loading plates twice. My mother's people sat straighter, spoke softer, looked at Danny the way you look at a stain on an expensive rug. I heard the word, sweet, deployed about him 3 times, and each time it meant, beneath us. I overheard someone murmur that it was a shame. A girl with her sense. I kept my chin up and my hand in Danny's and worked the room. The entire time my mother sat at the center table like a queen awaiting her cue, that wrapped box beside her plate. Not Grandma's craft paper parcel. A different one. Gloss white silver ribbon. Expensive looking. Exactly the kind of presentation you'd expect to hold something magnificent. My grandmother had asked me to wheel her right up to the head table beside me and Danny. I did. She kept one hand on my arm the entire time, exactly as she'd instructed. When the plates were cleared, Carol stood and tapped her ring against a glass. The room hushed the way rooms do for her. Before the dancing, she announced in her warm public voice, "I'd like to give my daughter and her new husband a small something. A family tradition. There is no such family tradition. I have been part of this family my entire life." Under the table on my other side, Danny gripped my hand. My grandmother's fingers tightened on my arm. Carol lifted that beautiful white box off the table and extended it toward me, beaming in front of every soul we knew. Picture it, because she certainly did. 120 faces turned my direction, string lights overhead. My grandmother's hand on my arm, my husband's hand in mine. My mother, radiant, holding out a gift I already knew was a trap, and me with no earthly exit but to accept it, so I did. It was light, too light. A box that size, wrapped that meticulously, should have heft. This one carried none. I knew before my fingers found the lid what waited inside. I lifted it anyway, because 120 people watched, and my mother had wagered everything on my face. Inside, nothing. White tissue paper draped around empty air. No card, no coin, no note. Just the interior of an empty carton staring back up at me, and into that silence loud enough to land in the last row of the hall. Carol delivered the line she'd been sharpening for weeks. "That's all your marriage is worth." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My aunt laughed, my cousins laughed, and Renee laughed her half-second late laugh. The sound traveled through me like ice water. My mother stood there glowing, waiting for me to crumble, because the crumbling was the gift. The crumbling was the entire point. I looked down into that void and understood something I'd spent my life sidestepping. She hadn't given me nothing. She'd given me a mirror. This was how she'd always seen me. Dependable, useful. And now, completely worthless. The only person in that loud laughing room who wasn't laughing. 9 years old, mouth open, staring at her grandmother. And under the table, my grandmother's old hand shifted from resting to gripping. And I felt her lean close. Ruth pulled me toward her by the arm. Gently, the way she used to when I was small, with a secret worth telling. Her mouth was near my ear. Around us the laughter was still trailing off, and Carol was still standing, still radiant, still waiting for the tears she'd ordered. I didn't give them to her. I bent toward my grandmother instead, and into my lap. Hidden by the tablecloth and my own two hands, she pressed that little brown paper parcel. It was warm from her lap. It was heavier than it looked, she whispered, and her voice didn't waver once. Don't open it here. Wait until you're back in your seat at the head table where you belong. Open it there. Slow and steady. She waited until I turned to meet her gaze. Her eyes were wet and fierce and 84 years old and absolutely certain. When you open it, you look straight at your mother. You don't look away. You understand me? You look right at Carol. I nodded. I couldn't speak. My palms closed around that craft paper box, and I felt the shape of what lay inside. Small, hard, round, and something folded. Paper Carol finally sat down satisfied, assuming the show was over, assuming she'd conquered the evening. She had no idea the evening hadn't actually begun. I straightened up. I set the empty white box aside without a word, which I could see baffled her. Because a reaction had been the entire reason she'd constructed it. I carried my grandmother's little parcel back to my chair at the head table. Under the warm lights my husband had strung with his own hands, and I laid it in front of me and untied the twine. The paper came away quiet in my hands. Inside was a small wooden chest, hand-built. I knew my grandfather's craftsmanship. I knew those joints. Inside that chest, resting on a square of blue felt, sat 3 objects. The first was a wedding band, a thin gold ring worn almost to a wire along the underside. The way metal thins when a woman wears it every day for 60 years and never once removes it. My grandmother's ring. The second was a small brass pin, dulled and tarnished green at the edges, stamped with the seal of a pipefitters and plumbers union and a serial number beneath. The third was a slip of paper folded in quarters. When I unfolded it, I recognized my grandmother's handwriting, the rounded loops she'd learned in a one-room schoolhouse 80 years ago. It was brief. Everything this family has, he built with these. They called him nothing. He was the richest man I ever knew. Wear the ring when you forget your worth. Wear the pin when they try to set it for you. And at the bottom, a single underline, I have never forgotten. They said he was worth nothing. He built everything you're standing in. I read it twice. Then I did exactly what my grandmother had told me to do. I looked up and looked straight across the reception at my mother, Carol, who had been laughing and glowing and accepting congratulations for her clever little stunt, saw the wooden chest open in my hands. She saw the brass pin catch the light, and the color drained from her face like water out of a cracked tumbler. She half rose from her chair, her hand shooting to the table's edge. For a heartbeat, I thought she was going to stand fully and cross the room and rip it from my hands. She stopped herself. She sank back down, but everyone at our end of the hall had witnessed it. My mother was afraid, and I finally understood that the empty box had never been the real gift in that room. I sat there with a brass union pin in my palm, and 33 years of small strange things rearranged themselves in my skull simultaneously. My entire life, my mother had constructed a story about our origins. Old family, good bloodline, people of a certain standing, she'd say, as if standing were something you inherited, like a nose shape. But no one ever named what my grandfather actually did for work. I'd never once heard his job title spoken in Carol's house. When I was small, there had been a photograph in the hallway. A man in coveralls with his sleeves rolled up, grinning beside a length of pipe. One day it vanished. When I asked about it, my mother said it had been the wrong photograph for that wall. I was 8. I didn't press. Now I held the seal of a union in my hand, green with age, worn smooth by the thumb that must have polished it 1,000 times. And I realized, the man in the missing photograph and the man who built the staircase that never creaked were the same man. My mother had spent my entire childhood quietly erasing him, every ounce of standing she was so proud of, every bit of name and reputation she'd been willing to sacrifice me to defend. It had all been built by a plumber, by precisely the kind of man she'd just seated at the children's table, by exactly the kind of man she'd just told 100 people my marriage was worthless for choosing. I looked up from the pin, and across the room, my mother was already in motion. She'd stood, smoothed her skirt, restored her smile to its proper place, and she was striding directly toward the head table, toward me, toward the little wooden box, with the brisk, purposeful momentum of a woman arriving to mop a spill before it stains. She reached me with her party smile mounted, eyes like January. She leaned close and murmured, "We should step out together for a moment." And to anyone watching, it looked like a mother drawing her daughter aside for a sweet word. I went, because I didn't want this in front of Sophie, and because I wanted to hear what she'd say when she thought no one was listening. In the corridor by the coat racks, she dropped the smile like she was shrugging off a coat. "Put that box away," she said low and fast. "This is neither the time nor the place." I asked her what she was so afraid of. I heard her own sentence drum through my head. "That's all your marriage is worth." And for the first time in my life, it sounded exactly as hollow as the carton she'd pressed into my hands. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she pivoted, the way she always pivots, to money and to obligation. She told me my grandmother was confused. Not well, she gets ideas. She said the lake place is deteriorating and needs to be sold before Ruth does something impulsive with it. She delivered it smoothly and quickly, and I felt the shape of the jagged thing beneath the words, the clause too clean, the real reason for the entire performance. My mother didn't merely want that house sold. She needed my grandmother's signature handing it over to her. And soon, before anyone thought to ask Ruth what she actually wanted, and she needed me quiet, grateful, restored to my place, while she did it. I looked at my mother in that hallway, and I stopped being afraid of her. It was the strangest sensation, like setting down a bag I'd hauled for so long I'd forgotten. It was heavy. Let me step out of the story for a moment, because I think some of you are sitting exactly where I was sitting. If your worth has ever been decided by people holding a checkbook, hear me say this. You are not the one who's poor in that room. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And stay with me, because the morning after my wedding is when everything truly shifted. Back in the hall, I went and I danced with my husband. And I didn't let Carol steal one more minute of it. But my mind was working the whole time, the way it works over a flawed contract, hunting for the trap and the escape hatch. I read documents for a living. I know what it looks like when someone is trying to move a piece of property fast and quiet. The rescinded funding, the public humiliation, the sudden urgent talk of selling. The story about Grandma being confused, all of it pointed one direction. My mother was staging the transfer of that house before anyone thought to intervene, and the empty box was a piece of it. A way to break me down, to remind me I had no standing to object. She had miscalculated one thing. My grandmother had just given me a reason to stand. That night, after the final guest departed, and Danny was folding the chairs into stacks, I made a decision at the head table with the wooden chest still open before me. Not revenge. A visit. I decided that in the morning, before anything else, before the honeymoon, before I even changed out of my going out clothes, I would drive out to the lake and sit down with my grandmother and ask her one simple question. What do you actually want? The morning after my wedding, Danny and I drove the 25 minutes to the lake with 2 coffees and no notion of what we were walking into. My grandmother was on the porch when we arrived, dressed and alert, waiting like she'd known I'd come. Let me state it clearly, because Carol had repeated it so often. I half expected to find a woman lost in her own kitchen. Ruth Anderson was not confused. She was doing the crossword in pen. She poured us coffee into mugs Walter had made special trips to the hardware store for. She had Danny sit in Walter's armchair, and she studied him for a long moment and said he had good hands. I watched my husband's ears turn pink. Then she told me to sit, because there were things I should have been told years ago and wasn't. And she was done letting my mother decide what I got to know. She began at the start. She told me she'd married Walter in 1961 against her own family's wishes, because they'd claimed a plumber was beneath a girl of her breeding. Her mother had wept at the wedding, and not the joyful kind of weeping. Her family had gifted her a set of everyday dishes, the cheap variety, to underscore the life they thought she was sinking into. She smiled when she said it. 60 years I ate off those dishes, she said, and every single meal was better than anything on their china. She reached across the table and laid her worn palm over mine, the one wearing her ring now. You married a good man, Gail. I know exactly what your mother made you feel last night. I felt it in 1961. Now let me tell you the rest. Here is the rest. The thing my mother had spent 30 years painting over. There is no old family money. There never was. The standing my mother is so proud of. The name, the reputation she'd sell her own daughter to defend. All of it came from Walter Anderson's two hands. He started as an apprentice pipe fitter at 19. He worked frozen job sites and burned summers in boiler rooms. He saved and eventually launched his own plumbing and mechanical company with a single truck and his own name on the door. It grew. By the time my mother was a teenager, Walter employed 40 men and ran a real business. The kind that put a girl through college without loans. He paid for every piece of the life Carol now pretends she was born into. And Carol had grown up as the plumber's daughter in a town that never let her forget it. Kids at school sneered and called her the plumber's daughter. She hated it. Hated the trucks in the driveway, the coveralls in the laundry, the way her father's hands never quite washed clean. So the moment she had the means, she reinvented the entire story. She married a man with a quiet office job and a family name that sounded like money. She moved to the right neighborhood. She buried her own father under a fiction about old family so thoroughly that her own children never learned the truth. My grandmother said it without bitterness. Just fact. Your mother is ashamed of the man who paid for everything she has. I sat there with the pin resting in my palm. The empire Carol had lorded over the entire reception, the standing that made my marriage a bad investment, had been constructed by a plumber, by the very species of man she'd just humiliated me for loving. And she knew it. That was why she had gone white. My grandmother rose then, slower than she used to, and returned with a shoebox full of photographs my mother didn't know still existed. She spread them across the kitchen table. And I want to be fair to Carol here, because my grandmother was. In one photo, my mother is about 12, standing at the fringe of a school dance in a homemade dress. You can see it in her face, even in black and white. The shame, the way she's holding her arms like she wants to dissolve. Grandma touched that photograph and her voice softened. She told me the other girls had worn store-bought gowns and had made sure my mother knew it all night. She said Walter heard about it, and he picked up extra weekend shifts for 2 months, on his knees under other people's sinks, so he could buy his girl one dress from the good downtown shop, the kind the other girls wore. My mother wore it once. Then she stopped attending dances. Something in her broke at 12 and decided she would never be the poor girl again, that she would climb so high nobody could ever look down at her. And she climbed straight over her own father to do it. I looked at that frightened 12-year-old in the photograph and felt something I didn't want to feel for the woman who'd handed me an empty box. I felt sorry for her. My grandmother watched me feel it, and then she said the thing that prevented it from softening me into compliance. Being hurt like that explains her, Gail. It does not excuse selling this house out from under me. And it does not give her the right to set a price on you. Understanding a person and obeying them are two different things. Then my grandmother reached for the sideboard and passed me a folder, and my paralegal brain went cold and clear the instant I opened it. Inside was a quitclaim deed, already completed professionally, transferring the lake house from my grandmother's name into my mother's. All it lacked was Ruth's signature. My mother had delivered it out the week before, my grandmother said, along with a great deal of talk about how the house was too much to maintain, how Ruth might fall out here alone, how it would be simpler if Carol simply handled things. She'd left the deed on the table, like an invoice you're expected to settle, and she'd told my grandmother a notary would visit that Monday to make it final. 2 days out. I asked my grandmother gently. Because I had to. Whether she wanted to sign it, whether perhaps the property was genuinely too much. She looked at me like I'd asked whether she wanted to sign away her own hands. "This is the house Walter built me," she said. "I fished off that dock with you. I am not confused, and I am not tired of my own life. Carol wants it sold so she can erase the last thing in this world with his fingerprints on it. And I have been too frightened and too polite to stop her." Her chin trembled once, then it steadied. "I don't want her to have it, Gail. But I don't want it to be a weapon either. I've had enough of this family measuring things. I just want it safe." I sat there with a notary arriving Monday and my grandmother's whole heart on the table, and I understood that the thing I was good at, the boring, careful thing nobody ever praised me for, might be the only thing that could actually help. So I asked my grandmother the plain question I'd driven there to ask. Not what Carol wanted. Not what would be easiest. What did Ruth herself actually want to happen to this house? She thought about it for a long stretch, turning her coffee mug between her palms, and when she answered, she was unmistakable. She did not want to give it to me directly. She said that first, looking straight at me because she knew me. "If I hand it to you outright, Gail, your mother will say I was confused, and you took advantage. And you'll spend the rest of your life defending yourself. And worse, it'll become a thing that gets measured." I'm done with measuring. What she wanted was for the house to stop being something anyone could sell, fight over, or wield as a blade. She wanted it placed in a trust that couldn't be broken, so she could live in it for the rest of her days. And after her, it would stay in the family as a place, not a price. A place where any Anderson who married for love instead of standing would always have somewhere to go. She wanted Walter's name on it. The real one. The plumber's name. The union man's name. They said he was worth nothing, she said again, quiet, looking at the pin in my palm. Let this house say otherwise for 100 years. I told her I could help her do it properly. With a real estate attorney and a physician to certify she was of sound mind, so no one could ever claim she was confused. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then let's beat Monday," she said. And for the first time in that entire rotten weekend, I laughed. That night my mother phoned and her voice was different, soft, almost warm. I hadn't heard that register aimed at me in years, and God help me, some old hungry part of me sat up like a dog at a familiar door. She said she figured we'd both said things. She said perhaps the box was too much, which was the closest Carol Anderson had ever come to an apology. And then, gently, she laid out her offer. If I would let the house situation resolve quietly, meaning, let her sell it, and if I would keep all that old Union folklore to myself and not go stirring up the family with stories about Grandpa, then she would reinstate me in her will. She would fund a real honeymoon. She would, she said, welcome you back into this family, where you belong. She said she was proud of me. Do you understand what she was offering me? Everything, the exact prize I'd been auditioning for since I was 5 years old. My mother's approval, delivered over the phone in a warm voice. My name restored to the ledger. My seat at the table returned. All I had to do was stay quiet and let her sell my grandfather's house, and continue pretending he was nobody. For one long stretch, standing in my kitchen the day after my wedding, I wanted it so badly, I couldn't breathe. That is the honest truth. The little girl who'd bought birthday presents and signed 2 names wanted to say, yes, so fast. I told my mother I needed to think. She said, of course, sweetheart, take your time. And the word, sweetheart, went into me like a fishhook. I hung up, and I sat down on my kitchen floor, because the thing I wanted most on earth, and the thing I couldn't live with, had just turned out to be the same thing. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table most of the night, with my grandmother's ring on my finger, and my grandfather's pin in front of me, and I did the hardest arithmetic of my life. Not with a calculator. My mother had taught me to add up people, and I was finally trying to unlearn it. Here's what I saw somewhere around 3 a.m. The empty box hadn't wounded me, because it was cruel. Cruelty I could have absorbed. It wounded me because some part of me believed it, because somewhere deep inside I'd accepted Carol's math a long time ago, that I was worth what I could demonstrate, that love was something you earned by being useful, and that if I ever stopped performing, I'd be precisely what she said. An empty box. I'd been keeping score my whole life on her scoreboard, and her offer, the will, the honeymoon, the sweetheart, was just her handing me the same scoreboard back and asking me to keep playing. If I said yes, I'd win the game and lose the only thing actually worth having, the right to stop playing it. Danny found me at the table as the sky went gray. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat beside me and laid his rough hand over my grandmother's ring and waited. And I knew I was going to help my grandmother place that house beyond anyone's reach on Friday, before Monday's notary ever arrived. And then I was going to give Carol my answer. Not on the phone, not quietly, but at the family brunch that weekend, in front of the same people who'd watched me open an empty box. Not to humiliate her. I was done with that scoreboard, to simply finally stop paying a bill that was never real. Friday morning, I took the day off, put on my good blazer, and drove my grandmother to the office of a real estate attorney I trusted from the courthouse. A methodical woman named Patricia Vaughn, who doesn't cut corners. I want to be clear about how unspectacular this was, because there was no magic in it, no miracle clause. We did it the slow, boring, correct way. The way I do everything, the way nobody ever thanks you for. My grandmother met with Patricia alone first, so no one could ever claim I was in the room steering her. A physician my grandmother had seen for 2 decades came by that same morning and documented in writing that Ruth Anderson was of sound mind and knew precisely what she was doing. Then, of her own free will, my grandmother placed the lake house into an irrevocable trust. She retained the right to live there for the rest of her life. After her, it would pass into the family as a protected place that could never be sold, and the trust named it, in plain letters on its first page. The Walter Anderson house, when she signed, her hand didn't tremble. Mine did. Patricia notarized it, filed it, and it was done. Real and legal and permanent. 2 days before Carol's Monday notary was ever going to arrive, on the drive home, my grandmother rolled down her window and let the wind tangle her hair like a teenager's. 60 years, she said, watching the lake pass. He'd have liked knowing it can't be sold. Then she glanced at me. You did that with the thing they never respected about you. All that carefulness, look what it saved. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I have thought of it that way every day since. The family brunch was that Sunday at my mother's house, on the good china. Carol hosts a brunch the way she does everything, as a performance of a life she wants you to believe she was born into. The long table, the fresh flowers, the linen napkins folded into shapes. She had, I could tell the moment I walked in, prepared a scene of her own. She thought I was coming to say yes. She'd told people I was coming to say yes. I could read it in the way she'd arranged the seating. In the bonus warmth, she aimed at Danny for the first time ever, in the chair at her right hand she'd left open for me. The golden seat, the one I'd craved my whole life. She thought this was the morning her useful daughter came home and accepted the deal, and she'd constructed a whole stage to receive me graciously in front of the family. Renee was there. My aunts, the cousins who'd laughed, and Sophie, who had barely spoken to her grandmother since the wedding, and who came and sat down beside me instead, close, the way I'd once sat close to Ruth. I set my grandmother's little wooden chest on the table beside my plate. Not hidden this time. Out where the light could catch it, my mother saw it, and her smile wavered for half a second. Then she smoothed it back and clinked her ring against her glass and rose to welcome me home. I let her get all the way through the warm opening. The "we're so glad you've come to your senses," the reaching for my hand. I let her assemble the entire set, and then I stood on my own 2 feet at my mother's table and I said, "Thank you." Carol beamed, because "thank you" was the opening line of the speech she'd scripted for me in her head. She thought I was about to accept. She actually reached for her glass to toast, so she made her offer concrete, out loud, in front of everyone, thinking she was sealing it. She announced to the whole table that she and I had worked things out, that I was back in the family, back in her will, that she'd be helping Danny and me get properly settled. She said it generously, like a queen restoring a banished daughter. She looked around to gather the warm murmurs, and she got them. My aunts nodded. Renee smiled with relief. Everyone waited for me to sink back into the golden chair and be grateful, and let the family close back up over the whole ugly week like water closing over a stone. I could feel the gravitational pull inside my own body. Say yes. Sit down. Be enough at last. Take the seat you've bled for. And I stood there inside that pull, with my grandmother's ring on my finger, and Sophie's shoulder against my arm, and my husband's steady eyes on me from across the table. And I understood precisely what I was being offered, and precisely what it cost. She was offering me everything I'd ever wanted in exchange for the single thing I'd just discovered I couldn't sell. My mother lifted her glass toward me, waiting, glowing, certain. I did not lift mine. I stood there, calm as still water, in a way that I promise you cost me more than any scene ever could. And I said, "Mom, I need to say something first, and I need you to hear all of it before you toast." I didn't raise my voice. I want you to know that everything I'd learned about her told me the loudest thing I could do in that room was stay quiet, because Carol had spent her whole life afraid of one specific thing, and it wasn't anger. It was the truth, spoken plainly, without shame, so I said it plainly. I opened the little wooden chest and lifted out the thin gold ring and told them it was my grandmother's. 60 years of it. Then I lifted out the brass pin and pinned it to my blazer where everyone could see. And I told them whose it was. I told them about Walter Anderson. Not as a weapon, but as an introduction, because most of the people at that table had never really been told. I told them he was a pipe fitter, a union man, that he built his own company with his own hands, and that every good thing any of us had, this house, this china, the college degrees, the standing, all of it came from a plumber who woke before dawn and came home with his hands full of other people's problems. I said my grandfather's name out loud at my mother's table, the name she'd spent 30 years erasing, and I watched her go white all over again. The same white as the wedding. Then I told them the rest, gently, without a drop of triumph. I told them Grandma had decided, of her own free will, with her own lawyer and her own doctor, to place the lake house into a trust in Walter's name. So it could never be sold. So it would always be a home for anyone in this family who chose love over standing. And Grandma had asked me to help her do it. So I did. On Friday, my mother rose halfway out of her chair, her palm flat on the table, her mouth open, and for a single instant I saw the entire thing shatter across her face at once. The shame, the fury, the 12-year-old in the homemade dress, all of it. Then, into that silence, I gave her my answer to her offer. Thank you for the offer, Mom. The will, the honeymoon, all of it, truly. But I'm not going to keep quiet, and I'm not going to help you sell his house. So I don't think you'll want to give me any of it. And that's all right. My mother's face hardened into something I recognized. The winter returned to her eyes. And she said the thing she believed would end me. She said if that was my choice, I was out of the will for good. Out permanently, and I would receive nothing from this family. Not $1, ever. She said it like she was slamming a vault shut. She waited for me to flinch. She'd handed me an empty box once already, and watched me not cry, and I think she badly needed to see it finally land. And here is the part I didn't choreograph and will never forget. I looked at my mother, and then at Danny, whose lights were still on across that table, and at my grandmother's ring on my finger, and at Sophie watching me the way I once watched Ruth, discovering in real time that you're allowed to stand up. And I told my mother the truest sentence I have ever spoken aloud. You can keep the money. My worth was never yours to set. The room went so quiet I could hear the clock in the hall. Carol had spent 33 years gripping the only pen that could write my price, and I had just, calmly, in front of everyone, taken it from her hand and set it down. I lost the inheritance in that moment. I lost the golden chair. I lost the last thin thread of a mother's approval I'd been chasing since before I could read. I felt every fragment of it depart, and underneath the losing, steady as Danny's hand, I felt myself come loose. I didn't storm out. There was nothing left to perform. I told my mother I loved her, which was and is true, and made it worse for her, not better. Then I picked up the little wooden chest, and my husband collected our coats. And we left. Sophie caught me at the door. She tugged my sleeve and pointed at the brass pin on my blazer and asked, in that clear 9-year-old voice that carries across a silent room, "What's that, Aunt Gail?" I knelt, so we were eye to eye. I told her it had belonged to her great-grandfather, and that he built houses and repaired pipes, and that he was one of the finest men who ever lived, and that anyone who told her different didn't understand what a person was worth. She nodded very seriously, filing it away, and she asked if she could visit the lake house someday. I told her it would always be there, that it could never be sold now, and that it was hers to visit for the rest of her life. Behind me, I heard my mother sink slowly into her chair at the head of her beautiful table, and Renee, my sister, who has laughed half a second behind our mother her entire life, did not laugh. She stood in the doorway of the dining room with her napkin still in her hand, looking at me, then at the pin, then at her own daughter, and something crossed her face I'd never seen there before. Doubt. The first genuine doubt. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I drove home with my husband, my grandmother's ring, and my grandfather's pin. Poorer than I'd been that morning by every measure my mother knew, and richer than I'd ever been in my life by the only one that turned out to matter. It's been 6 months. I'll tell you the truth, because this isn't a fairy tale and you deserve the real ending. My mother did take me out of the will, and she meant it. We don't speak much. She still tells people we come from old family, still hosts her brunches, still opens the calculator when she's upset. The wound that produced her never healed, and wounds like that don't dissolve because her daughter grew a spine. I didn't fix my mother. You can't, but the lake house stands, and it will keep standing, with Walter's name on the deed where anyone can read it. My grandmother still lives there. Every Saturday, Danny and I drive the 25 minutes out, and he fixes whatever's loose while I do the crossword with her. In pen, we hung the photograph back up in her hallway, the one Carol made disappear. The man in coveralls grinning beside his length of pipe. Renee has started calling me, occasionally, careful, like a woman testing ice, but calling. And Sophie asked her mother last month why nobody ever talks about the great-grandfather who could fix anything. I heard Renee didn't have a good answer, and that she didn't enjoy not having one. That's how it cracks. Not all at once, not in one loud scene at a wedding. It breaks the way my grandfather's stairs never did. One careful joint at a time. In the next generation, in a 9-year-old who now knows precisely what a plumber was worth. It took an empty box to teach me the single thing my family never could. Nobody gets to set the price of your worth. Not your mother, not your family, not the whole laughing room, nobody. Unless you're the one who hands them the pen. That's my story. An empty box, a tarnished union pin, and a house that will never be for sale. If someone ever tried to measure your worth in dollars, and some quiet, stubborn part of you refused to hand them the pen, let that be your sign today. Go call the person who saw you clearly. And if this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.